There's a strange, haunting moment that eventually arrives in every empath's life. A moment when something deep inside you goes completely silent. From the outside, it looks like you've simply shut down. It looks like you've turned cold, like the fire of your love has finally burnt out, and you've become the kind of heartless person who just doesn't care anymore. But that is the world's greatest misunderstanding. This day isn't about loss, it's about a sacred internal revolution. Carl Jung discovered that this state isn't depression, nor is it mere emotional exhaustion. He identified it as the final stage of spiritual awakening. It is the heavy, hallowed moment when your soul officially resigns from being the volunteer emotional emergency room for everyone around you. For a long time, you didn't just care. You managed people. You were a psychic shock absorber, operating in a state of what Jung called psychic porosity. Your nervous system had no filters. It was a public utility that anyone could plug into. You walked into a room and instinctively scanned the atmosphere like a high-precision radar. Who's off? Who needs reassurance? What do I need to fix so this doesn't explode? You did it so automatically that you didn't even realize it was costing you your life. You saw the architecture of your own destruction in every social setting. Family dinners left you spiritually hollow because you were busy managing the unspoken tensions of the whole table, soothing a father's ego or absorbing a mother's resentment just to keep the peace. Friendships drained you because you were forced to carry both sides of every conflict, grieving for people who wouldn't even grieve for themselves. Romantic relationships nearly destroyed you because you felt your partner's pain more intensely than they did. You loved them so much that you became a stranger to your own needs. But then, the tipping point arrives. Not with a dramatic fight or a final screaming, "I'm done" speech. It's a silent internal shift, a strange diamond-hard calm. It's the moment your system simply refuses to be a martyr anymore. Something inside you finally sits down, takes a deep breath, and says, "No more." And that calm is what scares people, because it isn't emotional. It's not negotiable. It's not a reaction they can soften with a cheap apology or reset with a flash of affection. It is clarity. Jung understood that at this point, you stop performing the role of the healer or the safe place. You realized that identity was never your true self. It was a survival strategy. It was how you stayed safe in a chaotic home. It was how you earned love in emotionally immature environments by becoming useful. The day the empath stops caring isn't the day you lose your heart. It's the day your heart finally gets protected. It's the day your compassion finally grows a spine. It's the day your nervous system stops being publicly available. Once that happens, you don't become cruel. You become untouchable. You become impossible to guilt trip, difficult to bait, and unresponsive to the chaos. To the people who benefited from your endless access, you now look dangerous. Not because you attacked them, but because you stopped feeding the pattern that kept them powerful. You are no longer their shock absorber. You have finally become the sovereign of your own soul. Silent awakening. When the emotional emergency room closes, there's a strange, haunting moment that eventually arrives in every empath's life. A moment when something deep inside you goes completely silent. From the outside, it looks like you've simply shut down. It looks like you've turned cold, like the fire of your love has finally burnt out, and you've become the kind of heartless person everyone feared you'd be. But that is the world's greatest misunderstanding. This day isn't about loss. It's about a sacred, internal revolution. Carl Jung discovered that this state isn't depression, nor is it mere emotional exhaustion. He identified it as the final stage of spiritual awakening. It is the heavy, hallowed moment when your soul officially resigns from being the volunteer emotional emergency room for everyone around you. Before this silence arrived, you didn't just care. You managed everyone's existence. You were a psychic shock absorber, operating in a state of what Jung called psychic porosity. Your nervous system had no filters. It was a public utility that anyone could plug into. You walked into a room and instinctively scanned the atmosphere like a high-precision radar. Who's off? Who needs reassurance? What fire do I need to put out before this whole thing explodes? You did it so automatically that you didn't even realize it was costing you your life. You saw the architecture of your own destruction in every social setting. Family dinners left you spiritually hollow because you were busy managing the unspoken tensions of a whole table, soothing a father's ego, absorbing a mother's resentment, and keeping the peace at the expense of your own breath. Friendships drained you because you were forced to carry both sides of every conflict, grieving for people who wouldn't even grieve for themselves. Romantic relationships nearly destroyed you because you felt your partner's pain more intensely than they did. You loved them so much that you became a stranger to yourself. But then, the tipping point arrives. Not with a dramatic fight or a final screaming "I'm done" speech. It's a silent internal shift, a strange diamond-hard calm. It's the moment your system simply refuses to be a martyr anymore. Something inside you finally sits down, takes a deep breath, and says, "No more." And that calm is what scares people, because it isn't emotional. It's not negotiable. It's not a reaction they can soften with a cheap apology or reset with a flash of affection. It is clarity. Jung understood that at this point, you stop performing the role of the healer or the safe place. You realize that identity was never your true self. It was a survival strategy. It was how you stayed safe in a chaotic home. It was how you earned love in emotionally immature environments. The day the empath stops caring isn't the day you lose your heart. It's the day your heart finally grows a spine. It's the day your compassion becomes sovereign. You aren't becoming cruel. You are becoming untouchable. You are no longer the shock absorber for their chaos. You have finally become the architect of your own peace. The architecture of self-abandonment. The cost of being the world's shock absorber. Before we can truly understand why that final silence arrives, we have to look at what pushes an empath to the edge in the first place. Carl Jung spent decades studying his most sensitive patients, and he noticed the exact same haunting pattern over and over again. These weren't just sensitive people. These were individuals whose entire nervous systems functioned like high-powered emotional receivers, constantly tuned into a frequency that most people don't even know exists. Jung called people like this the emotional shock absorbers of their social world. You don't just empathize with someone's suffering. You absorb it, process it, and somehow transmute it into something the other person can actually live with. You are the filter through which their toxicity is purified, but you are the one left holding the poison. This gift manifests in your life as a series of invisible, exhausting labors. The family dinner as a battlefield. You walk into a room and instantly feel the tension no one else is talking about. You sit down for a normal family meal and leave spiritually hollowed out because you spent the entire time unconsciously managing every unspoken argument and every hidden resentment. You were the one holding the atmospheric pressure steady so the house wouldn't explode. The friendship drain. Your friendships slowly exhaust you because you are always carrying both sides of every conflict. You feel your friend's heartbreak, but you also feel the hidden guilt or rage of the person who hurt them. You are a 24/7 therapist who never gets off the clock. The romantic destruction. This is where the pattern nearly destroys you. You end up feeling your partner's sadness, fear, and emptiness more intensely than they ever feel it themselves. You become an emotional support system whose only purpose is to keep their ego intact, while your own soul is starving for air. But here's the most heartbreaking part of Jung's observation. Most empaths never complain. You accepted this role as your sacred purpose. You genuinely believed your sensitivity was a divine obligation to sacrifice your own peace so everyone else could feel okay. You wore your exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof that you were a good, selfless person because you cared enough to suffer in silence. This isn't just personality. It's deep-seated childhood conditioning. You were praised for being so mature, for always making everyone feel better, for keeping the peace no matter what. Every time you swallowed your own needs to accommodate a chaotic parent or a fragile sibling, you received love and validation. You were wired to believe that virtue is synonymous with self-abandonment. Jung realized that while you were busy managing everyone else, you were creating a dangerous psychological dissociation. On the surface, you were the perfect caretaker, but underneath, the pressure was building like steam in a sealed vault. You were gathering a lifetime of data on everyone's patterns, but you were burying your own soul under layers of sacrifice. You didn't realize that kindness without boundaries isn't a virtue. It's a slow-motion suicide. The silence that is coming isn't because you've stopped loving. It's because the shock absorber has finally run out of room to take the hits. The soul is preparing for its most dangerous and necessary move, the Great Resignation. The silent cartographer and the trap of the kind one. But here's what Jung noticed that empaths themselves could never see while they were still drowning in the middle of it. Behind that beautiful, compassionate face you showed the world, your psyche was quietly keeping perfect, lethal records. Every single manipulation, every subtle betrayal, every time someone weaponized your kindness against you, it was all being logged with surgical precision deep in the unconscious mind. You weren't just enduring, you were becoming a master cartographer of human dysfunction. But here is the part that people, and even you, misunderstand. You weren't clueless. You weren't naive. You weren't too nice to notice. You noticed everything. You noticed exactly who only called when they needed something. You noticed who disappeared the second it was time to show up for you. You noticed the way your partners or family members kept rewriting reality just to stay innocent. You saw the pattern. You've seen it for a long time. But you had a habit that was quietly destroying you. You refused to use what you saw. You didn't want to be that person. You didn't want to judge, to assume the worst, or to make it about you. So even when your intuition was screaming, you did the empath thing. You gave the benefit of the doubt. You softened the truth. You told yourself they were just stressed or wounded or that they didn't mean it. Jung would call this a projection. Not the shallow version people use online, but a deep psychological error. You projected your capacity for conscience onto people who weren't operating from a conscience at all. You projected your sincerity onto their performance. You projected your desire to grow onto their desire to win. Because you are driven by pain, you assumed pain was what drove them. But for some people, it isn't pain. It's control. This is where your kind one identity became a lethal trap. If your identity is built on being the understanding one, then being direct feels like betrayal. If your identity is built on being the patient one, then leaving feels like cruelty. If you are the safe place, then protecting yourself feels like you're doing something wrong. So you stayed. You stayed in situations you already understood. You stayed even after you had already seen the map. And while you were staying, something invisible was happening. Your psyche was keeping a tally. Every time you swallowed your truth to keep the peace, it got stored. Every time you apologized for something you didn't do, it got stored. Every time you forgave a pattern that never changed, it got stored. Jung's point was simple. Anything you force into the unconscious doesn't vanish. It compresses, it grows, and eventually, it demands to be seen. Your body began to speak what your mouth wouldn't. It spoke in tension, in brain fog, in that heavy, sickening dread you felt right before their name flashed on your phone. The shock absorber was full. The archive was complete. You didn't randomly stop caring one day. That day was being built, brick by brick, every time you traded your inner truth for someone else's comfort. Until finally, the psyche decided for you. It didn't ask for your permission. It just sat down and said, "Enough." The split heals, the pressure releases, and the empath doesn't just wake up. They become strategically dangerous. The cartographer finally stops drawing the map and starts using it to find the exit. The breaking point. The collapse of the holy projection. This is usually where the great resignation begins. It rarely happens with a small argument, a simple misunderstanding, or just a rough week. Empaths don't break from a single bad moment. They break from a pattern that keeps repeating until something happens that is too undeniable to spiritualize, too obvious to excuse, and too painful to love through. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection. It is the violent, necessary moment when you stop projecting your depth onto someone else's emptiness. It's the kind of betrayal that doesn't just hurt your feelings, it reorganizes your entire inner world. Sometimes it's finding out the truth you were never supposed to see. Sometimes it's realizing the person you defended for a decade has been systematically disrespecting you behind your back. Or worst of all, it's watching them hurt you, then calmly watching you bleed, as if your pain is just background noise to their ego. And here's the most devastating realization of all. You knew. Deep down, in your gut, in your body, in that quiet inner voice you kept strangling, you felt the inconsistencies. You saw the slips. You noticed how the story always changed. You noticed how accountability never landed on them. It always somehow landed on you. But you kept going anyway. Because when you are trapped in the good one identity, you don't just hope people will change. You hope that your love itself will be enough to change them. So the betrayal doesn't just expose the other person. It exposes the cost of your own self-abandonment. That is why it hits so hard. The pain isn't just, "Why would they do this to me?" It becomes, "Why did I keep staying when my soul was warning me the whole time?" This is the moment the spell breaks. You stop projecting your conscience onto their convenience. You stop projecting your desire to grow onto their desire to control. You stop seeing a misunderstood, wounded person you can fix, and you start seeing a system. A structure that only worked because you participated in it. When this moment hits, people expect an explosion. But most empaths don't scream. They don't go on a revenge tour. They don't even always confront. Instead, something far more unsettling happens. They go quiet. Not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of recognition. It is a stillness so profound it feels unreal, like your nervous system has finally stopped running on adrenaline and started telling the truth. You might even look fine on the outside, but inside, a massive, heavy door is closing. Because once you clearly see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once your body finally accepts the truth, you can't fake safety anymore. You can't keep laughing at the jokes that cut you. You can't keep calling blatant disrespect communication issues. You can't keep holding your breath every time they walk into the room and telling yourself that's normal. Your psyche simply won't let you. This is the moment the empath realizes the 3 laws of their new life. If love requires me to shrink, it isn't love. If loyalty requires me to betray myself, it isn't loyalty. If understanding requires me to ignore reality, it isn't wisdom. After the breaking point, you don't become heartless. You become accurate. You stop negotiating with the truth. You stop offering endless access to people who only show up to take. The old version of you, the one who could be guilted, baited, and pulled back in, disappears. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally stopped lying to yourself about what this really was. You have withdrawn your soul from the narcissistic ecosystem, and for the first time in your life, You are finally sovereign. The Great Resignation, exiting the emotional economy. After the breaking point, something begins to happen that feels confusing at first. You don't become numb overnight. You don't suddenly lose your empathy or wake up as a different person with a cold heart. What changes is subtler, yet more powerful than anyone realizes. You stop participating. And that is what stopping caring actually is. It's not a lack of feeling. It's the end of emotional labor without consent. For a long time, your empathy wasn't just a gift. It was a currency. Others used it to regulate their own chaos. They leaned on you to translate their bad behavior, to carry the accountability they refused to touch, and to do the heavy repair work after they broke things. You weren't just a partner or a child. You were a buffer between them and the consequences of their own actions. You were the unpaid shock absorber for their entire internal world. The uncomfortable truth is this: some people loved you not for who you were, but for what you did for their nervous system. You made them feel less guilty, less anxious, and less responsible. You provided them with a relief they refused to earn for themselves. You did it so consistently that it became your role, not a relationship. So when you stop caring, you are actually withdrawing from a system where your soul has been turned into a commodity. You stop paying the emotional bills that aren't yours. You stop financing someone else's comfort with the raw material of your own health. This is why it feels so dramatic to them, even though you aren't doing anything dramatic at all. From their perspective, it's not that you set a boundary, it's that their supply just got cut off. They will accuse you of changing. They will call you cold, selfish, or different. And you are different. You aren't colder, you are clearer. You are no longer volunteering to be the emotional container for someone who refuses to contain themselves. What makes this stage so lethal to a narcissist is how quiet it is. You stop chasing answers. You stop explaining your motives. You stop trying to make them understand what they've done. You've accepted a truth your old self couldn't handle. If someone needed your suffering to stay close to you, they never loved you. Instead of rushing to repair, you pause. Instead of defending, you observe. You stop responding instantly. You stop walking into every emotional fire they set. This is where the narcissistic machine starts to malfunction, because the entire dynamic is fueled by one essential ingredient: your reactivity, your tears, your anger, your need to be seen as good. That is their oxygen. When you stop providing the fuel, the engine stalls. At this stage, you'll notice a strange phenomenon. The calmer you become, the more chaotic they become. They push harder. They create midnight emergencies. They rewrite history. Not because they are more emotional, but because the old levers no longer work. They are trying to re-establish control over a public service that just went private. This is the day you reclaim your empathy from those who were exploiting it. You stop acting like your nervous system is a public utility. You let silence do what your explanations never could: reveal the truth. Because in that silence, you finally see what was actually there. When you stop managing the relationship, you realize there wasn't much of a relationship left. It was just you, working alone. Stopping caring is not an ending. It is a return. A return of your energy to your own life. A return of your attention to your own body. You are finally taking your warmth back from those who were only using it to keep themselves warm while you froze. From the outside, it looks like coldness. But from the inside, it feels like the first time you've ever been truly warm. You are no longer a victim. You are finally sovereign. Shadow integration, when kindness finally grows a spine. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable. When an empath stops caring the way they used to, the world demands a simple explanation. They want to label it as bitterness. They want to call it trauma, or say you've become damaged and closed off. But what's actually happening is far deeper. You are integrating the part of you that you were taught to reject. Jung called it the shadow. It's not evil in the childish sense. It's simply the pieces of your humanity you shoved underground because they didn't match the saint role you thought you had to play to be loved. For most empaths, the shadow isn't cruelty. It's strength. It's the anger that's been waiting to speak. It's the ability to disappoint someone and not collapse. It's the right to choose yourself without writing a 5-page apology. Empaths don't usually struggle with compassion. They struggle with power. Somewhere early on, you learned a dangerous equation. Power equals harm. Boundaries equals rejection. Saying no equals being selfish. So you cut off your own assertiveness and called it spirituality. You cut off your anger and called it being the bigger person. You cut off your own needs and called it love. And that is exactly why you were so easy to manipulate. If someone can convince you that protecting yourself is immoral, they can access you forever. They can disrespect you and still get your softness. They can drain you and still get your loyalty. Not because you're weak, but because your goodness had no guardrails. Shadow integration doesn't turn you into a monster. It turns you into a full human being. You stop identifying as only the gentle one or the healer. You stop trying to be a safe place for people who keep setting fires. When you integrate that suppressed power, your energy changes. You don't argue louder, you argue less. You don't threaten, you follow through. You don't need to convince anyone. You just move. This is where you learn the life-changing difference between being kind and being available. Being kind means your heart is open. Being available means your boundaries are optional. The healed empath no longer confuses the two. You learn that love without boundaries isn't love, it's access. And access is the only thing narcissistic patterns depend on. When your kindness finally gets a spine, the narcissistic system feels threatened, not because you're attacking them, but because you're no longer predictable. You are no longer guilt-driven or bait-driven. Most importantly, you are no longer controlled by the fear of being seen as the bad guy. The ability to be misunderstood without panicking is your ultimate superpower. Narcissistic dynamics rely on keeping you performing, explaining, proving, and apologizing, not because you did something wrong, but because they want you trapped in the posture of someone constantly trying to earn their own innocence. Shadow integration ends that performance. You stop trying to look pure and start trying to be real. And real people have limits. Real people say no. Real people leave. Jung called this individuation, becoming whole, no longer split into good me versus bad me. As long as you are split, you can be controlled. But when you become whole, you become grounded. You stop confusing empathy with responsibility. You can understand why someone is the way they are without offering your life as the price of that understanding. You can feel compassion for their wounds without letting those wounds become your prison. You can even forgive without reopening the door. This isn't hatred. It isn't revenge. It is emotional sovereignty. Once you own your inner world, they can't live in it anymore. They can't push buttons that no longer exist. They can't weaponize your morality against you. This is why the empath finally becomes dangerous. Not because you became darker, but because you stopped being divided. Your heart stayed soft, but your life stopped being accessible. Selective empathy. You don't become cold, you become precise. This is where the biggest misunderstanding happens. When an empath changes, the world usually describes it in the simplest, laziest way. They got cold, they stopped caring, they're just not the sweet person they used to be. But what's actually happening isn't coldness, it's precision. The healed empath doesn't lose empathy, they stop wasting it. You stop pouring high-grade emotional labor into low-integrity situations. You stop giving sacred access to people who treat your closeness like an entitlement rather than something to be earned. To those who lived off your unlimited availability, this feels like rejection. It feels like punishment. But Jung would call this discernment, the moment your consciousness stops being a free public service and starts becoming a private sanctuary. Selective empathy in real life is a quiet revolution. You don't answer the text right away, not to play games, but because you refuse to let someone else's urgency hijack your nervous system. You don't rush to soothe someone who just hurt you. You finally understand that your pain counts too. You don't stay on the phone while someone escalates. You aren't over it. You've just stopped being available for disrespect. You stop holding space for the same apology on repeat, because you've learned the difference between true remorse and reset button behavior. The old empath used empathy to stay connected at any cost. The healed empath uses empathy plus reality. You don't just feel what's happening. You name what's happening. You stop using your ability to understand their trauma as an excuse for their lack of character. Once you reach this stage, your presence changes. You're still kind, but you're no longer porous. You listen, but you don't absorb. You care, but you don't carry. And for people who were used to your empathy being a free resource, this feels like betrayal, because they were never responding to your heart. They were responding to your availability. This is why the labels change. They stop calling you loving and start calling you selfish. They stop calling you mature and start calling you cold. In family systems, this stage is explosive. Families often don't love you for who you are. They love you for what you manage. You were the peacekeeper, the translator, the emotional shock absorber. When you stop doing that invisible labor, the system doesn't say, "Thank you." It panics. It calls you ungrateful. Why? Because a dysfunctional system depends on one person being overly functional to survive. At work and in romance, the truth finally reveals itself. If a relationship was built on mutual respect, the other person adjusts and grows to meet you. But if it was built on access, on your patience and your endless forgiveness, then selective empathy will expose it. The moment you stop bending, the relationship either straightens or it snaps. The hardest truth to accept is this: some people don't miss you. They miss the version of you they could use. They miss your soothing. They miss your willingness to absorb their chaos and call it love. The empath becomes dangerous at this stage because you are no longer emotionally negotiable. You don't need a fight to hold a boundary. You don't need a villain story to justify distance. You don't even need to hate them to choose yourself. You just choose yourself, quietly, consistently. Selective empathy breaks the one assumption narcissistic patterns survive on, that you will keep showing up no matter what. Once that assumption breaks, the narcissistic ecosystem collapses. You haven't become a different person with a different heart. You've just finally put a lock on the door of a house that used to be open to everyone who wanted to trample through it. You are no longer a resource. You are a human being. The Great Resignation, the collapse of the invisible pillar. After the breaking point, the people closest to you feel the shift instantly. It's as if a frequency they've been tuned into for decades suddenly goes silent. Their reactions are almost predictable, yet they reveal the brutal truth of the system you've been upholding. Family members who once counted on you to be the emotional glue suddenly look at you with a mix of confusion and panic. The accusations start flying. How could you be so selfish? What happened to the old you? You've changed. They say it like a criminal charge, like you've breached a sacred unspoken contract, and you simply nod. Because yes, you have changed. You've finally stopped setting yourself on fire just to keep everyone else warm. The narcissist's spiral, the storm outside the sealed house. The narcissist in particular begins to spiral. They reach for every weapon in the playbook that used to work like magic. They manufacture fresh crises. They play the victim louder than they ever have before. They send the "I miss the old you" texts, the guilt trips, the grand gestures, the silent treatment, the hoovering attempts. But here is the shift. None of it touches you anymore. You watch the drama unfold with a calm, detached clarity, like you're observing a violent storm from inside a perfectly sealed house. You can see the lightning. You can hear the thunder, but you don't feel the rain. Their emotional hooks have nothing left to grab onto. And what truly shakes them to the core isn't your anger, which they could fight, or your tears, which they could mock. It is your complete indifference, a peaceful, unshakable indifference that acts as a mirror to their own emptiness. The crumbling of the dysfunctional machine. This is when entire systems start to crumble, not because you attacked them, but because you quietly removed the one invisible pillar that was holding the dysfunction in place. Family dynamics that looked normal on the surface begin to disintegrate because you've stopped absorbing the tension. Friendships that felt deep reveal themselves as one-sided and parasitic. Work environments that ran smoothly suddenly descend into chaos because you've withdrawn the invisible emotional labor that was fixing everyone else's mess. The people who benefited most from your unconscious servitude finally realize exactly how much they were taking from you. But by then, you've already moved beyond caring about their realizations. You don't need their understanding. You don't need their approval. You don't even need them to acknowledge the magnitude of your sacrifice. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't bitterness. This wasn't you becoming cruel. This was sovereignty. You finally learned that your extraordinary gift of empathy was never meant to be a public utility. It was meant to be protected, honored, and shared only with those who can match your depth and respect your boundaries. Jung called this state psychologically invincible, not because you can never be hurt again, but because you've integrated your capacity to feel with the wisdom to choose your response consciously. You can still read the narcissist from a mile away. You can still sense their pain and perceive every unspoken lie, but none of it controls you anymore. You have transitioned from being the exhausted, unconscious slave of your empathy to being its conscious director. You are no longer the shock absorber. You are the architect. You are free.